Ambassador G1 stood in the center of the Galactic Council chamber, her hands clasped behind her back. The chamber was enormous, with crystalline walls that stretched up into darkness. 17 platforms floated in a circle around her, each one holding a representative from the elder species of the galaxy. Most of them were not paying attention. Counselor Threx Mal, the reptilian speaker of the council, scrolled through his datapad while G1 spoke. His scales were deep purple, and his eyes barely glanced in her direction. On another platform, 3 counselors were having a quiet conversation among themselves. One was eating something that smelled terrible. G1 continued her report in a calm, measured voice. She talked about human colony production numbers. She mentioned trade agreements and resource allocations. She used phrases like strategic repositioning and logistical consolidation. Everything sounded routine and boring. That was exactly the point. The truth was far different from what her words suggested. At that very moment, across 200 light-years of human space, the largest coordinated movement in galactic history was underway. Every human colony was being evacuated. Every station was being emptied. Every outpost was being abandoned. Millions of ships moved in careful formation toward the galactic rim, where unknown space waited beyond the reach of the Council's sensors. This moment had been planned for 30 years. Not in anger, though humanity had plenty of reasons to be angry. Not in fear, though the Council's treatment of them had given cause for concern. The plan was born from a simple realization that came gradually to human leadership. The Galactic Council would never see them as equals. Ever. For 2 centuries, humanity had been part of the Council. For 2 centuries, they had contributed innovations that other species took credit for. They had maintained systems that others couldn't be bothered to understand. They had solved problems that everyone else ignored. And for 2 centuries, they had been treated like useful servants rather than respected partners. Humans sat at the children's table during important votes. Their proposals were dismissed without discussion. Their territories were encroached upon by elder species who faced no consequences. When humans complained, they were told to be patient, to wait their turn, to remember that they were the newcomers to galactic civilization. 200 years, and they were still newcomers. So humanity had made a decision. Not to fight, because fighting would be blamed on human aggression. Not to protest louder, because that would be dismissed as human emotion. Instead, they decided to leave. Quietly, completely, permanently. The preparation had been meticulous. New faster-than-light drive systems were developed in secret research stations hidden in asteroid fields. Probe ships were sent beyond the galactic rim, mapping hundreds of worlds suitable for colonization. Supply chains were gradually shifted away from Council dependencies. Food production was increased and stockpiled. Ships were built in orbital yards, far from major trade routes. All of this happened while humanity maintained perfect diplomatic courtesy. They fulfilled every trade agreement to the letter. They staffed every station they were assigned to. They attended every council session. They smiled and nodded and said, "Yes, Counselor," and "We understand, Counselor," and all the while, they prepared to disappear. Director Hyunwoo coordinated the exodus from Earth. He sat in a command center deep beneath the surface, watching status reports flow in from every human world. The evacuation was proceeding exactly on schedule. Mars colony, complete. Titan station, complete. New Sol on Proxima, 98% complete. The numbers kept updating, green lights spreading across his display like stars coming out at night. Captain Da-un waited in orbit aboard the last diplomatic vessel. Her ship was small, sleek, and fast. It carried minimal crew and maximum speed. When G1 finished her address and left the council chamber, Da-un would be waiting to take her home. Or rather, to take her to humanity's new home. Somewhere the council would never find them. G1 reached the conclusion of her report. She mentioned that humanity would be restructuring its economic partnerships and pursuing new developmental opportunities. She thanked the council for their time. She bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that the council had never returned in 200 years. Then she turned and walked out of the chamber. Her footsteps echoed on the polished floor. Not one counselor called after her. Not one asked for clarification. Not one seemed to notice anything unusual at all. Threxmal marked the human report as received in his system and moved on to the next agenda item without a second thought. G1 walked through the empty corridors of the council station. The human embassy had been cleared out 3 days ago. Every file was deleted. Every piece of equipment was removed. Every bit of human technology was either taken or destroyed beyond recovery. The rooms were empty shells now. Bare walls that showed no sign humanity had ever been there. She stepped onto the transport platform and signaled for Daun. Within minutes, the diplomatic ship docked. G1 boarded without looking back. The ship disengaged and accelerated away from the council station, joining a stream of thousands of other vessels all heading in the same direction. As they passed through the outer marker of council space, Daun allowed herself a small smile. All ships are reporting successful departure, Ambassador. We're the last ones out. G1 sat down in the passenger cabin and closed her eyes. 200 years of patience. 200 years of being overlooked and underestimated. 200 years of contributing to a civilization that never appreciated the contribution. All of it was over now. Set course for the rendezvous point, she said quietly. Let's go home. Behind them, the Galactic Council continued its session, completely unaware that humanity had just walked out of galactic civilization forever. The discussions continued about trade routes and territorial disputes, and all the petty concerns of species who thought themselves important. It would be 3 days before anyone noticed that something was wrong. By then, humanity would be gone, vanished into the dark between stars, leaving behind only empty buildings and a mystery that the Council would struggle to understand. The great human exodus was complete. Not with war, or drama, or angry speeches, simply with a quiet, dignified departure that spoke louder than any words could have. 3 days passed before Councillor Threxmal noticed anything unusual. He was reviewing quarterly reports when he realized that the human economic data was missing. He sent a message to the human embassy requesting the information. The message bounced back with an error. Station not found. Threxmal frowned at his screen. Technical errors were common enough on the aging council station. He tried again, this time requesting a direct communication link to Ambassador G1. Another error. He tried the Human Trade Office. Error. The Human Medical Center. Error. The Human Residential Sector. Error. Now concerned, Threxmal dispatched a security team to the human embassy physically. They arrived at the embassy entrance 20 minutes later and found the doors unlocked. They pushed them open and walked into empty rooms. Not messy or ransacked, just empty. The walls were bare. The floors were clean. Every desk, every chair, every computer terminal was gone. The security chief sent an immediate alert to the council. Within the hour, analyst Velshara arrived to investigate. She was an Archivian, a species known for their meticulous attention to detail. Her forearms carried various scanning devices, and her compound eyes could see wavelengths that most species could not. Velshara walked through the empty embassy slowly, scanning everything. What she found disturbed her more with each passing minute. The data systems had not just been erased, they had been wiped at the quantum level. No possibility of recovery. The walls showed no residue of removed equipment. Everything had been cleaned with professional precision. Even the air recyclers had been removed from their housings. She moved to the human residential sector next. 2,000 apartments, all empty. Furniture gone. Personal belongings gone. Not a single forgotten item left behind. Children had lived here. Families had made homes here. Now there was nothing but clean, bare rooms that echoed when she walked through them. The investigation expanded. Velshara assembled a team of 50 analysts. They checked every human facility on the station, then sent queries to human colonies across Council space. The reports came back one by one, each more alarming than the last. Mars colony, abandoned. All equipment removed. Infrastructure disabled. New Sol on Proxima, empty. Titan station, vacated. Europa base, cleared out. The pattern was the same everywhere. Humans had not fled in panic. They had carefully, methodically packed up their entire civilization and left. Velshara requested access to Council shipping records. What she discovered made her mandibles click in shock. For 30 years, human cargo shipments had been gradually increasing. More ships, larger vessels, all moving toward the Outer Rim territories. At the time, it had seemed like normal expansion. Now, it was obvious. They had been moving their supplies, their equipment, their resources out of Council space piece by piece. She pulled up human trade agreements next. Every single contract had been fulfilled exactly as written. Not one obligation left unmet. But starting about 5 years ago, humans had stopped renewing contracts. They had completed their current agreements and then politely declined to negotiate new ones. At the time, Council officials had barely noticed. Humans were always signing agreements with someone. The more Velshara investigated, the clearer the picture became. This was not a sudden decision. This was a plan that had been in motion for decades. Humanity had decided to leave, and they had prepared with terrifying efficiency. She found records of human-operated stations being transferred to other species. Complete operational manuals had been provided. Training sessions had been offered. The humans had been trying to teach others how to run the systems they had built. Most species had ignored the training, assuming they could figure it out if needed, or that humans would always be around to ask. Velshara traveled to the ruins of the human research station on Deimos. This had been one of their primary science facilities. Like everything else, it was empty. But here, she found something different. In the main computer core, buried deep in the system, was a single message file. It was not hidden, exactly, but it required someone to look carefully to find it. The message was from Engineer Tae-jin, dated 3 days before the Exodus. It was simple and direct. We came to the galaxy, seeking peers. We found masters who did not want equals, and children who did not want to grow. Neither are worth our time. We are leaving to build something better. Do not attempt to follow. You are not ready for where we are going. Velshara brought the message to the Council immediately. The reaction was not what she expected. Instead of concern or self-reflection, most counselors responded with anger. How dare humans judge them? How dare these newcomers, these children of the galaxy, decide that the elder species were not worthy of their presence? Counselor Threxmal was particularly outraged. They were here for barely 2 centuries. We have civilizations older than their entire species. Who are they to lecture us? 1. But some counselors, like the younger Ixvar, saw things differently. Perhaps we should ask ourselves why they left, Ixvar suggested quietly. In 200 years, did we ever truly welcome them? Did we ever treat them as equals? The question was ignored. Instead, the Council voted on a response. They would send ships to track the human fleet. They would demand an explanation. They would insist that humanity return and fulfill their obligations to the galactic community. Commander Keeksthar was assigned to lead the tracking mission. He assembled a fleet of 20 vessels, some of the best ships in Council space. They followed the trajectory that human ships had taken, heading toward the galactic rim, where maps became sparse and stars grew distant. They made it 3 weeks into deep space before problems began. Small things. At first, a power coupling failed on one ship. Then a navigation system glitched on another. A life support processor needed recalibration on a third. Normal maintenance issues. Except that the crews discovered they did not actually know how to fix them. The ships were human-designed. Not built by humans, but designed by them decades ago, and then produced by council species who followed the blueprints without truly understanding them. The maintenance protocols were documented, but they were complex and required careful attention. The council crews had grown used to just asking human technicians when problems arose. Now there were no human technicians to ask. Commander Chixthar watched his fleet slowly fall apart in the void. One by one, ships had to turn back, as systems failed beyond the crew's ability to repair. His flagship made it the farthest, almost a month out, before a critical reactor stabilizer began to malfunction. The chief engineer admitted he did not know how to fix it. They had to return. The fleet limped back to council space, humiliated. They had not even encountered any enemy. Their own ships had defeated them. Velshara compiled her final report. It was thorough and devastating. Humanity had not just left. They had revealed how dependent the council had become on them. For 200 years, humans had quietly become the galaxy's maintenance workers, technicians, and problem solvers. Not because they were forced to, but because everyone else could not be bothered to learn. The council had taken credit for human innovations while never actually understanding how they worked. They had the blueprints, but not the knowledge. They had the tools, but not the skill. And now the humans were gone, taking their competence with them. The report included Tajin's message. It ended with Velshara's own conclusion. We did not lose humanity. We never actually had them. We had their labor, which we took for granted. We had their innovations, which we claimed as our own. We had their patience, which we mistook for weakness. What we never had was their respect, because we never earned it. They did not abandon us. They simply stopped pretending we were worth their time. The council filed the report and voted to proceed without human assistance. They were elder species. They had survived for millennia before humans arrived. They would survive after humans left. It was a decision they would come to regret. The first major failure happened 6 weeks after humanity's departure. The primary power grid on Varanth Prime, the Council's capital world, went down without warning. 3 billion people were plunged into darkness. Emergency backup systems activated, but they were only designed to last 72 hours. The grid engineers gathered in crisis meetings, pulling up technical documentation that they had never bothered to read before. The power system was a human design, implemented 40 years ago as part of an infrastructure modernization program. It was efficient and reliable, which was why no one had paid much attention to it. It just worked. Except now it did not work, and no one knew how to fix it. The documentation was thorough. Thousands of pages of technical specifications and maintenance procedures, but it was written for people who understood the underlying principles. The council engineers had never learned those principles. They had always just called human technicians when something needed adjustment. After 3 days of failures, they managed to get the grid partially restored using a crude workaround that reduced efficiency by 60%. Rolling blackouts became necessary. Citizens complained. Politicians demanded answers. The engineers had no good answers to give. Then, the communication relays started failing. The galaxy-spanning network that allowed instant communication between star systems began developing gaps. A relay station would go offline, and no one could get it back online. The relays were automated and supposedly required minimal maintenance. That minimal maintenance had always been performed by humans. Within 3 months, the faster-than-light communication network had degraded by 30%. Some regions of Council space could no longer communicate with each other in real time. Messages had to be carried by ship, taking weeks or months instead of seconds. Trade coordination became difficult. Political unity became harder to maintain. Councillor Threxmal convened emergency sessions, but the problems kept multiplying faster than solutions could be found. Medical equipment in council hospitals, began malfunctioning. The devices were too complex for most doctors to repair themselves. Agricultural automation systems on farming worlds broke down, threatening food supplies. Water purification plants needed recalibration that no one knew how to perform properly. It was not that these systems were deliberately designed to fail without humans. They were simply designed by people who understood how to build things properly. And now, they needed maintenance from people with that same understanding. The council species had the intelligence to learn, but they had never developed the culture of patient, careful maintenance that humans practiced naturally. Dr. Yuna's research papers became suddenly popular. She was a human xenobiologist who had spent decades studying the psychological differences between species. Her work had been published in council academic journals and almost universally ignored. Now, desperate bureaucrats were reading her papers, looking for answers. One paper in particular circulated widely. It was titled, "The Human Approach to Problem Solving: Persistence and Systematic Thinking." In it, Yuna had documented how humans approach technical problems differently from most council species. When something broke, humans would work on it until it was fixed. Even if that took hours or days. They would read documentation thoroughly. They would test solutions systematically. They would learn from failures and try again. Most council species, Yuna had observed, would attempt one or two solutions and then give up if those did not work immediately. They would delegate the problem to someone else or simply accept that the thing was broken. This was not stupidity or laziness, just a different cultural approach. For millions of years, council species had relied on vast populations and redundant systems. If something broke, you used a backup. If that broke, you built a new one. But human systems were designed for efficiency rather than redundancy. They were meant to be maintained and repaired, not replaced. And now, no one remembered how to maintain them. Minister Bora appeared in dozens of training videos that were discovered in archived files. She had been a colony administrator who had tried for years to train council personnel in basic maintenance procedures. The videos showed her patiently explaining how to calibrate sensors, how to diagnose power flow issues, how to read system logs to identify problems. In the videos, the non-human trainees looked bored. Some were clearly not paying attention. A few asked when they could just call a human technician instead of learning this themselves. Bora remained patient and professional. But her expression showed that she knew her efforts were probably futile. The council had not been deliberately malicious in their dependence. They had simply taken the path of least resistance. Humans were good at technical work and seemed happy to do it. Why spend time learning complicated systems when you could just ask a human to handle it? It had seemed like a reasonable division of labor at the time. Now the consequences of that choice were becoming catastrophic. Power grids failed on 70 different worlds. Orbital stations lost life support and had to be evacuated. Transportation networks broke down. Supply chains collapsed. People died from equipment failures in hospitals and ships and habitats. The council tried to hire private contractors to fix the problems. But most contractors were equally dependent on human-maintained systems. Some tried reverse engineering human technology, but that took time and often failed because the underlying theoretical knowledge was missing. Councillor Ixvar led a coalition of younger politicians who advocated for a complete change in approach. "We need to learn," he insisted in council sessions. "We need to actually read the documentation, practice the procedures, develop the skills. Humans left us everything we need to succeed. We just have to do the work." But pride and panic made poor teachers. Some council members insisted that accepting human help, even from documentation, was admitting defeat. Others were too desperate for quick fixes to commit to the slow process of genuine learning. Factions formed. Arguments erupted. The unified Galactic Council began to fracture. Regional governments started making their own decisions. Some sectors committed to serious technical education programs, bringing in the few non-human experts who had actually learned from humans during their time in council space. These regions began to slowly stabilize, though at a much lower level of technological sophistication than before. Other regions refused to adapt. They insisted that they could maintain their old standard of living without human help. These areas fell into darkness, as systems failed faster than replacement systems could be built. Populations declined as people fled to more stable sectors. Proud civilizations that had lasted 10,000 years collapsed within a few years. Velshara watched it all with a growing sense of horror and understanding. She had been promoted to chancellor now, one of the few officials who seemed capable of seeing the situation clearly. She spent her days coordinating relief efforts and her nights studying human training materials, trying to teach herself the basics that her species should have learned decades ago. One night, alone in her office, she recorded a message and sent it into the void, toward where the human fleet had departed. She apologized for how humanity had been treated. She acknowledged the mistakes the Council had made. She asked, without much hope, if humanity would consider sharing more knowledge, or perhaps sending advisors to help. She did not really expect a response. The humans had been clear. They were done. With the Council. Weeks passed. Months passed. No response came. The Council continued its slow collapse. Some regions learning and adapting, others failing and fading into isolation. The great galactic civilization that had stood for 10 millennia was breaking into pieces, brought down not by war or plague or conquest, but by simple dependence and the quiet departure of the people they had depended on. And somewhere beyond the galactic rim, humanity built their new civilization, free from masters who could not see them as equals and children who refused to grow up. They did not gloat over the Council's struggles. They simply moved forward, focused on building something better. The Council was left to learn the hardest lesson of all, that competence is not servitude, that courtesy is not weakness, and that when you treat your equals as your servants, you should not be surprised when they leave you to the consequences of your own choices. 5 years had passed since humanity departed. The Galactic Council no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The Grand Chamber, where 17 species once gathered to make decisions for the galaxy, was dark and empty. The station that housed it had lost power 2 years ago and was now abandoned, slowly drifting in a decaying orbit. Chancellor Velshara worked from a much smaller facility now, coordinating what remained of interspecies cooperation. She had aged considerably in 5 years. Her compound eyes were dimmer, and her movements were slower. The stress of watching galactic civilization collapse around her had taken its toll. The statistics were grim. 30% of former Council space was completely dark now. All advanced technology failed or failing. These regions had reverted to pre-industrial conditions in some cases, or were simply dead in others. Another 40% had experienced severe technological regression, maintaining only basic systems. The remaining 30% had managed to stabilize at a reduced level of capability, learning enough to keep essential systems running. Councillor Ixvar, now much more prominent in what passed for galactic leadership, had led the successful stabilization efforts. His approach was simple and humbling. Accept that humans had been right. Accept that the Council had been lazy and arrogant. Accept that the only path forward was genuine learning and hard work. His coalition had gathered every scrap of human documentation they could find. Technician Jae Sung's maintenance logs had become essential reference texts. These logs detailed every repair Jae Sung had performed over a 20-year career, complete with diagnostic notes and lessons learned. They were boring, tedious, and absolutely invaluable. Scientist Minji's educational videos were required viewing in the new technical academies that Ixvar had established. She had created hundreds of hours of content explaining basic engineering principles, intended as supplementary education for young Council species who wanted to understand how things worked. At the time, almost no one had watched them. Now, they were studied with desperate intensity by adults trying to keep their worlds alive. The cruel irony was not lost on Velshara. Humanity had left them everything they needed to succeed: complete documentation, training materials, educational resources, step-by-step guides with diagrams and examples. The humans had even tried to gradually shift responsibilities during their final decades in council space, creating more detailed guides and trying to teach independence. Every effort had been ignored or resented. When humans asked council species to take more responsibility for maintaining their own systems, it was seen as humans being difficult or lazy. When they offered training sessions, attendance was poor. When they created documentation, it went unread. The council had wanted the benefits of human competence without putting in the effort to develop that competence themselves. Now they were paying for that choice. Velshara read reports every day about systems failing, populations suffering, and civilizations fading. Some species were adapting better than others. The Archivians, her own people, were doing relatively well because they already had a cultural emphasis on careful documentation and learning. The Varanthians, proud and stubborn, were suffering terribly because they refused to admit they needed to change. Threxmal was dead. The former council speaker had died when the medical facility on Varanth Prime lost power during a routine procedure. His heart had failed, and the automated systems that should have compensated did not activate because no one had performed the required maintenance. It was a quiet, undignified end for someone who had once wielded so much power. The new generation of leaders was different. They had grown up watching their civilization fall apart and understood that pride was a luxury they could not afford. They studied human materials not with resentment but with genuine appreciation for the knowledge being shared. In the new technical academies, students spent years learning what humans had apparently considered basic competence. They learned to read technical documentation carefully. They practiced diagnosing system failures methodically. They developed patience for the slow, careful work of maintenance and repair. It was hard, and many students failed. But those who succeeded became treasured experts in their communities. Velshara kept sending messages into the void. Once a month, she recorded a status update and transmitted it in the direction humanity had gone. She did not know if anyone was listening. She did not expect responses, but it felt important to maintain the contact, even if it was one-sided. Her messages were honest about the struggles. She described the failures and the suffering, but she also described the learning and the adaptation. She talked about the young Archivian engineer who had successfully repaired a power grid using principles from Minji's videos. She mentioned the Varanthian student who had spent 6 months working through Jaisung's maintenance logs and could now diagnose complex system failures. "We are learning," she said in one message. "Slowly, painfully, but we are learning. You were right about us. We were lazy. We were arrogant. We took your work for granted and never appreciated what you contributed. Some of us died before they could understand that. Others died after understanding it, which was worse. But some of us are changing. 1. We are becoming what we should have been all along." She paused, her mandibles clicking softly. "I do not ask you to return. You made the right choice in leaving, but I want you to know that your departure was not meaningless. It taught us what nothing else could have. That competence must be earned. That respect must be mutual. That there is no shame in doing necessary work. Only shame in refusing to do it." The message went out into the dark, joining dozens of others that had preceded it, all unanswered. Some regions of council space tried different approaches. A few attempted to develop their own technologies from scratch, refusing to use anything connected to human designs. These efforts mostly failed. The theoretical knowledge required to develop advanced technology was vast, and humans had already done the work of figuring out the efficient approaches. Refusing to learn from that was simply wasting time. Other regions tried to trade with species beyond council space, hoping to find new sources of technology or expertise. They discovered that most advanced species had heard about the council's collapse and wanted nothing to do with them. The story of how an entire galactic civilization had failed because they could not be bothered to maintain their own systems had spread widely. It was not a story that inspired confidence in potential partners. The most successful regions were those that embraced humility and hard work. They accepted that they were starting over in many ways. They built simpler systems that they actually understood. They trained people thoroughly before allowing them to work on critical infrastructure. They developed cultures of maintenance and care. It was slower than the old way. It was harder. But it was sustainable in a way the old council had never been. These regions would not collapse if one species decided to leave. They were learning to stand on their own. Ixvar visited Velshara one day, looking tired but satisfied. "We have 47 new graduates from the Technical Academy," he said. "They can maintain fusion reactors, communication relays, and life support systems without supervision. It took them 3 years of intensive study, but they know what they are doing." Velshara felt a small spark of hope. 47. Out of how many who started? 200, Ixvar admitted. The failure rate is high. This work is hard, and many cannot or will not do what is necessary. But 47 is better than none, and next year we will have more. They stood together in silence, looking out at the stars. Somewhere, out there, humanity was building their new civilization. Somewhere out there, they had probably already surpassed anything the Council had ever achieved. They would never know for certain, because humanity was not coming back. But maybe, Velshara thought, that was how it should be. The Council had to save itself. No one was coming to rescue them. They had to do the work, learn the lessons, and build something sustainable with their own hands. It was the hardest thing her species had ever done. It was also the most important. And slowly, painfully, against all odds and all their old habits, some of them were actually succeeding. The galaxy would never be the same as it was before. But perhaps, in time, it could be something better. Something built on genuine competence, rather than borrowed expertise. Something that could stand on its own. Humanity had given them that possibility when they left. Whether the Council species would actually achieve it remained to be seen. 50 years after the Exodus, explorer Juan made a routine jump into what his star charts labeled as uninhabited space. He was young, only 26, and he had been born on one of the colony worlds beyond the galactic rim. His parents had been born there too. His grandparents were part of the Exodus generation, but they had died when Juan was young. He knew the stories of leaving some place called the Council, but it all seemed like ancient history to him. His ship's sensors detected artificial structures in the system. That was unusual. This region was supposed to be empty. Juan ran a full scan and was surprised to find a small space station, clearly very old, still maintaining minimal power. Even more surprising, it was responding to his hails with an automated greeting in several languages, including Human Standard. Juan docked his ship and went aboard carefully. The station was in poor condition, barely functional. Emergency lighting flickered in the corridors. The air was stale but breathable. He found a central operations room where old computer systems were still running on backup power. The databanks contained extensive records. As Juan read through them, he felt growing confusion and then shock. This station had been part of something called the Galactic Council. Humanity had been members of this council. They had left, and apparently, the council had fallen apart afterward. He immediately sent a message to his ship, which relayed it to the nearest human outpost. Captain So-hyun received the report and decided this was worth investigating personally. She arrived 3 weeks later with a full research vessel and a team of historians and scientists. So-hyun was in her 50s, old enough to have grandparents who remembered Earth directly. She had heard more detailed stories about the council than Juan had. Still, reading the actual records was startling. The scope of what had happened was larger than the family stories suggested. They spent days downloading and reviewing data. The station's archives contained news reports, government documents, and personal logs covering the 50 years since humanity's departure. It was a chronicle of collapse and slow recovery, documented by species who had struggled to understand what had gone wrong. So-hyun found Velshara's messages. Dozens of them, sent monthly for decades into the void. Each one, a summary of conditions in council space and a reflection on what had been learned. The early messages were desperate. The later ones were more thoughtful and humble. The most recent was dated just 3 months ago. They are still out there, So-hyun said quietly, reading the latest message. Or, at least someone is. Still maintaining this station. Still sending updates. Hwan looked over her shoulder. Should we respond? It was a question that required more authority than either of them had. So-hyun sent a full report back to human government, including all the recovered data and her recommendation that they make contact. Then they waited. The response took 2 months to arrive, carried by a government vessel that brought observers and diplomats. Among them was an elderly woman named Ambassador G1, the same G1 who had delivered humanity's final address to the Council 50 years ago. She was 92 now, her hair completely white, but her eyes were still sharp. G1 read through the records carefully. She recognized names. Threxmal, dead now. Velshara, still alive somehow. Ixvar, who she remembered as a young counselor who had occasionally shown some sense. She felt a complex mix of emotions, reading about the collapse. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a sense of confirmation. They had been right to leave. The human government debated for weeks. Some wanted to help rebuild, arguing that humanity had a moral obligation to assist species in need. Others insisted that the council species needed to learn their lessons fully, and that interfering would only create new dependencies. A few suggested permanent isolation, treating council space as a failed experiment to be avoided. Ambassador G1 listened to the debates and finally offered her perspective. We left because they would not treat us as equals. If we return as saviors, we will recreate the same dynamic that made us leave. If we return as conquerors or judges, we become what we fled from. If we return as equals, willing to share, but not to carry, willing to trade, but not to serve, that might be worth doing. The decision, when it finally came, was measured. Humanity would make contact. They would share knowledge and technology through trade and education, not charity. They would establish diplomatic relations, but limited ones. They would not rejoin any galactic government. They would maintain their independence and their new civilization beyond the rim. Most importantly, they would not take responsibility for the Council's recovery. That was the Council's work to do. G1 returned to the old station along with a small diplomatic team. They repaired the station's communication system and sent a response to Velshara's messages. The response was simple. We received your transmissions. We are willing to talk. We are not coming back. The response that came from Velshara was faster than expected, arriving just 2 weeks later. She must have had a ship waiting near the station, monitoring for any signs of human contact. Her message was audio and video, showing an ancient Archivian who looked far older than her species typically lived. Thank you for responding, Velshara said, her voice shaking slightly. I am not asking you to return. I know that would be wrong, for both our peoples, but I wanted you to know what happened after you left. I wanted you to understand that some of us learned from it. She described the collapse in more detail than the records contained. She talked about the species that had failed and died. She talked about those that had adapted and survived. She talked about the new generation that was learning to value competence and maintenance, and the unsexy but necessary work that keeps civilization functioning. We built a culture on borrowed competence, she said. We took credit for innovations we did not truly understand. We relied on your labor while dismissing your perspectives. When you left, we faced the consequences of those choices. Many died. Many suffered. But some of us are different now. We had to change or perish. Some chose to perish. Others chose change. G1 listened to the entire message, then recorded her own response. But understand this clearly. We are not coming back to fix your problems. We will trade knowledge as equals, not as teachers to students or saviors to victims. We will share what we have learned in our 50 years beyond the rim, and you will share what you have learned in your 50 years of adaptation. That is the only relationship we will accept. Over the following months, a careful dialogue developed. Human ships began making scheduled visits to the recovered regions of Council space. They brought new technologies, but they sold them rather than gifting them. They offered training programs, but they charged for them and required serious commitment from students. They established trade agreements, but only with regions that had something valuable to offer in return. The relationship was professional, respectful, and deliberately distant. Humans were polite, but clear about their boundaries. They would help, but they would not carry. They would teach, but they would not do the work for others. They would trade, but they would not subsidize. Some council species resented this. They wanted humanity to feel guilty, to make amends by providing assistance freely. Those species received a standard response. Humanity had fulfilled every obligation before leaving, owed nothing now, and would not be manipulated by false guilt. Other species appreciated the approach. They understood that genuine respect meant expecting competence, not assuming helplessness. These species became trading partners and sometimes friends, building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than dependence. Quan ended up working as a liaison officer, traveling between human and council space. He found the work fascinating. The council species had developed differently than humans over the 50 years of separation. Some of their solutions to technical problems were clever and efficient. Some were crude but functional. All of them were owned by the people who created them, which gave them a pride that borrowed technology never could. One day, Juan asked Velshara what she thought humanity had taught the council by leaving. The old Archivian was silent for a long moment before answering. "You taught us that competence is not servitude," she said finally. "That courtesy is not weakness. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from people who do not appreciate you and build something better elsewhere. You taught us that we were not entitled to your work, your innovations, or your patience. You taught us that equals help each other, but do not carry each other. And you taught us that lesson the only way we could learn it, by removing yourselves and letting us face the consequences of our own choices." She paused, her mandibles clicking softly. "It was the hardest lesson we ever learned. Many died learning it. But it was the most important. We are better now than we were. Not better than you. Perhaps not even as good. But better than we were. And we did that ourselves. Which matters." Juan reported the conversation back to Captain Sohyun. She smiled slightly when she read it. "Good," she said. "They understand. Maybe in another 50 years, they will be ready for real partnership. Or maybe not. Either way, it is their choice to make, not ours to impose." The human ships departed on schedule, carrying trade goods and new knowledge back to the colonies beyond the rim. They would return in 6 months, with more to trade. The relationship would continue, careful and bounded, and explicitly equal. Behind them, the council species continued their slow rebuilding, doing the work themselves, learning the lessons that could only be learned through struggle and adaptation. Some would fail, some would succeed. All of them would do it, under their own power. And beyond the galactic rim, humanity's new civilization grew and thrived, built on principles of mutual respect, self-reliance, and the hard-learned understanding that sometimes the best way to help people is to let them help themselves. The galaxy would never again see humans as convenient laborers or junior partners. From now on, they would be seen as they should have been from the beginning. Equals, who chose their own path and demanded respect in return.